Let the deeds of your ancestors move you and incite your minds to manly achievements. O most valiant soldiers and descendants of invincible ancestors, be not degenerate, but recall the valour of your progenitors. So spoke Pope Urban II to a crowd of thousands from a platform in a meadow outside Clermont when he launched the First Crusade on November 27th in 1095. He was responding to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople's plea for help. By the end of the 11th century, Islam had subdued 2/3 of the Christian world. The infidel-occupied territory that remained was called the realm of war. Christians had to defend themselves or succumb to Islam. Raised in a ruthless warrior culture, the desert Arabs fought in small units of relatives and friends where their honour was at stake and merit alone permitted promotion. They also held a monopoly on camels, the only way of getting across the desert, giving them the edge. Aiming at stirring the spirit of the warriors in his audience, Urban graphically described the deeds of the Turks. They destroyed the altars after having defiled them with their uncleanness. They circumcised the Christians, and the blood of the circumcision they either pour on the altars or pour into the vases of the baptismal font. When they wish to torture people by a base death, they perforate their navels, and dragging forth the extremity of the intestines, bind it to a stake. Then with flogging, they lead the victim around until the viscera having gushed forth, the victim falls prostrate on the ground. What shall I say about the abominable rape of women? To speak of it is worse than to be silent. On whom, therefore, is the labour of avenging these wrongs and recovering this territory incumbent, if not upon you? Many of the noblemen listening to Urban's speech had taken to naming their daughters Jerusalem in honour of the holy city. Urban continued, "This royal city, situated at the centre of the world, is now held captive, and is in subjugation to those who do not know God. She seeks therefore and desires to be liberated, and does not cease to implore you to come to her aid. This was the aim of the Crusades." After a preaching tour of 2,000 miles that took a year to complete, Urban had recruited around 100,000 people, of which 60,000 were warriors. Of those, 6,000 to 7,000 were knights. In Europe today, this would equate to roughly 1.3 million crusaders. Taking the cross was the first step. This included a public ecclesiastical vow and the wearing of a cloth cross, only removed upon successful completion of the journey. This vow to God was legally binding. Anyone breaking it would be excommunicated. The heads of great families, the Crusaders, often bankrupted themselves to fulfill their duty as patriarchal protectors. Only 80% returned, most dying due to starvation and disease, rather than battle wounds. Not until World War I was this loss of a generation of leaders equalled, but their duty as men called on them to display fortitude, and they did. Normans predominated. Vikings are often dismissed as mere barbarians. Cantor claimed the Scandinavians had nothing to contribute to Western European civilization. But by 1071, the Normans, literally men of the north, the descendants of the Vikings, had driven out both Muslims and Byzantines and established the Norman kingdom of Sicily. 2 of the 4 main Crusader armies comprised Norman knights and were led by Norman noblemen. Robert, Duke of Normandy, and Bohemond, Prince of Taranto, of the Norman kingdom of Sicily, Robert, the son of William the Conqueror, had pawned the entire Duchy of Normandy to go, and Bohemond, nicknamed after the mythical giant, played the leading role in the success of the First Crusade, aided by his nephew, Tancred. The Emperor Alexius's daughter Anna, 14 at the time she met the Norman leader, wrote that the sight of him inspired admiration, the mention of his name, terror. His stature was such that he towered almost a full cubit over the tallest men. He was said to be at his best, making a last stand. No doubt Bohemond would today be seen as toxically masculine. Anna continues, "He was slender of waist, perfectly proportioned. His skin was very white, his hair was lightish brown, and not so long as that of other barbarians. There was a certain charm about him, but it was somewhat dimmed by the alarm his whole person inspired." This is the kind of man on whom the fate of civilizations depends. Anna notes there was a hard, savage quality in his whole aspect, due, I suppose, to his great stature and his eyes. Even his laugh sounded like a threat to others. His arrogance was everywhere manifest. He was cunning, too. The massed nobles and knights shocked Alexius. They had actually answered his call. Military activity was rare among upper-class Byzantines. Their armies comprised mercenaries and slaves. Eunuchs often commanded them. But eunuchs, Bohemond and his band were not. They disliked the decadence of Alexius and his court. He did not even command his men, nor did he join forces with the Crusaders. The small contingent he sent accompanied them only far enough to regain Byzantium's recently lost territory. Alexius called Jerusalem strategically irrelevant to the empire. But the Crusaders didn't need Alexius's help. The innovation resulting from the chronic warfare of medieval Europe meant the knights' armor, weapons and tactics allowed them to rout much larger Muslim forces. Their chainmail meant they left encounters looking like porcupines, but unwounded. After crushing overconfident Muslim armies at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, the Crusaders marched on the city of Antioch. Unable to surround it, they starved, while Antioch continued to receive supplies. Alexius didn't send food, and he withdrew his own forces. Although a Muslim relief force was slaughtered, Antioch still wasn't taken. Bohemond then managed to bribe a Muslim in command of a tower and led a band of Normans into the city. They took command of all the towers and let the other Crusaders in, killing the entire Muslim garrison. Led by the Turkish Sultan Koboga, another powerful Muslim army then arrived, and the Crusaders looked to Bohemond as their commander. Choosing not to accept a siege, he charged the forces through the bridge gate of Antioch to face Koboga's far larger host. Despite overwhelming odds, the victory was so crushing that the story spread that a contingent of mounted saints had descended from heaven and joined in the attack. Bohemond accepted the offer from the Christians of Antioch to become their new ruler. His nephew Tancred then led the Norman force from Sicily, while Godfrey of Bouillon led the Normans and all the other remaining Crusaders in their effort to take back Jerusalem. Fewer than 15,000 Crusaders remained, down by 2/3 from 2 years before. Jerusalem was the great Muslim fortress, and they also had a huge relief force on the way from Egypt. But a priest had a vision that victory could be gained if the Crusaders fasted for 3 days and marched barefoot around the walls of Jerusalem. The Muslims who leant over the walls to mock them as they did so were all dead 2 days later. The Crusaders built 2 movable wooden towers from which they fired their lethal crossbows and rushed into Jerusalem. Now numbering fewer than 10,000 men, the Crusaders marched south to meet the enormous Muslim relief force coming from Egypt. 50 miles south of Jerusalem, at the town of Ascalon, they clashed. Very few Muslims escaped. Their objective accomplished, most of the surviving Crusaders then sailed home. To preserve their victory, the remaining Crusaders, roughly 600, created 4 kingdoms, independent states along the Mediterranean coast. Chief among these was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and because of his noble excellence, the proven worth of his military service, his patient temperance, and also the elegance of his manners, the Germanic warrior Godfrey of Bouillon was asked to become its first Western king. Godfrey, now 41, had been one of the first over Jerusalem's walls. He had financed his own pilgrimage, selling the entire county of Verdun to King Philip of France. Crusading was incredibly expensive. A knight needed 2, ideally 3, war horses, a riding horse, pack mules, as well as his chainmail and other equipment. Godfrey had survived a bear attack and many other hardships. When he was offered the title of king, he reputedly remarked, "I will not wear a crown of gold in the city where the Saviour wore a crown of thorns." Instead, he took the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. After renewing his pledge to serve God and his army, he died a year after fulfilling his Crusader vow. But the Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted remarkably until 1291, defended by the 2 new military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers. Apart from the West's superior tactics and military hardware, especially the crossbow, the Crusades revealed, as Rodney Stark notes, that the real basis for unity among the Europeans was Christianity. They're also a reminder that what the American Psychological Association describes as the traits of toxic masculinity, competitiveness, dominance, stoicism, and aggression, are actually the qualities that civilizations often depend on to survive. Kenneth Clark noted in his documentary Civilization that all civilizations have their origin in war, and unless they can defend themselves, they also end in war as well. The Armenian women, when the Crusaders liberated Antioch, are said to have swooned as they watched the Turkish guards who had raped and abused them being butchered. The so-called toxic traits of masculinity are precisely the ones that women have valued. Men are the result of sexual selection by women, not natural selection. Stoicism, aggression, competitiveness, dominance were all put in the service of the protection of women and children and the weak by the Crusaders. And all these masculine virtues were, of course, directed by their faith.